Thanks. Thanks, Bree. Just briefly, I will do a land acknowledgement since Bree always makes you feel bad when they manage to pull it off at the beginning. So just take a second to recognize that we're coming from many different places. We're occupying many different territories, many of which are unceded and unsurrendered territories from the Indigenous peoples who lived here before us. I'm calling from Alberta, which involves some really complicated land ownership or land stewardship, where there's many different sort of peoples who've occupied the space that I'm sitting on. And the site nativeland.ca, is it native-land, Bree, or native land? Native-land.ca is a great place to see this big interactive map of all kinds of interactions and intersections of the peoples who've lived on different parts of the world over time. So just take a second, reflect on that, and with that, we will move on with the talk. So this particular 5-minute presentation is on chapters 17 and 18, and then because it's a double week, Bree will cover the next 2 chapters in a second, next 3 chapters actually, because 21 is pretty short. I found, I've got sort of a bigger question at the end of this chapter 17 section that I'd like to focus us on for a discussion. Otherwise, I'm just going to skim through the key sort of tables that Bedford included in this chapter. And then the next chapter is on security, which I found dreadfully boring. And so I'm going to do a very, very, very brief treatment of it. And then hopefully we can just avoid talking about it entirely, but you know, it's up to you, the group, if you want to chat more about the security of information in knowledge architecture. So with that, chapter 17 is on what Bedford called augmentation, derivation, and synthesis. And I was excited for this chapter. I was looking forward to a discussion on how, like, what I think of as the purpose of all of this, the use of knowledge and how exactly you use knowledge to make new knowledge. I think it was, I forget where I heard it, Merlin Mann or something in a talk at some point said that knowledge workers produce to add value to knowledge or use that knowledge to create value, something like that. We all are knowledge workers most of the time in this day and age. And so this is like the key to me. It's like, why are we doing all of this architecture? Well, it's to use it, to do something with the work or with the stuff we're collecting and maintaining. So with that, my question for this chapter was, what does the author think about using knowledge? And as you'll see, a spoiler, she doesn't really get into it. This is all very theoretical. She walks through some neat ideas in like 6 stages of how exactly knowledge is used, or roughly 6. How knowledge is consumed, I'll say, and added to, but then the details of it are left to us, I think. But I'd love to hear if somebody had a more optimistic takeaway. With that, this is sort of the breakdown of the chapter. So the idea is that knowledge is consumed and in 3 different ways: augmenting it, deriving from it, and integrating it with other things. And then she breaks down each of those 3 sections into these 6 pieces that we'll talk about in a lot more detail. But this is sort of the roadmap for the chapter. And I really wish, again, I could have read a book about this entire table, a better book maybe about this entire table. And so it was rough to see this presented in only so many pages. But yeah, so this is the breakdown Bedford presents. And I don't know about you, but these 3 categories, she doesn't really do a great job of dividing them up or of explaining why these are 3 particularly different categories. I found myself thinking when looking at these, it's like if you're augmenting knowledge, then you're deriving something from it, and then you are changing it to add to it. So it's augmented knowledge is about deriving knowledge from elsewhere and then adding to some knowledge that is at your focus, right? And then deriving knowledge probably means reading something or learning from something and then augmenting it with whatever's already in your head, right? And then same thing, like all of those things are integrative processes. So there's like, this is a tree diagram, but it's like actually a Venn. And it's one of those annoying Venns where everything intersects with everything else in a really convenient fashion. And so I find this, like, again, there's a lot more that I think we can talk about this idea, the use of knowledge, that isn't necessarily effectively addressed here, but we'll see. So I'm going to walk through those 6 pieces and not in extreme detail. And just as a quick aside, this is a great example of my frustration with the figures that have been in the book throughout the entire book. Each of the 6 sections that she presents here on the right: reviewed knowledge, annotated knowledge, interpreted knowledge, derivative knowledge, synthesized knowledge, and collaborative knowledge. She breaks down into these 3 sections. So the actions you take when you're doing that thing, the outputs that come from it, and then the value that doing it adds to the knowledge that you're working with. It's a great little framework. I like it. But why the hell is it this structure of graphic where there's like these awkward little gray boxes here on the top, and they get bigger and smaller depending on which section they're in? And, you know, I have a graphic design background, so I pay attention to these things, but it's like, it's just super clear that these are PowerPoint smart art pieces that aren't fully filled out or something. And it's just, come on, you can do so much better. These things deserve more. But that's a digression. So this one is on knowledge reviews, what you're doing when you're reviewing knowledge, what kinds of outputs come from it, and what kind of value it adds. And I find it interesting. So she anchored the sort of value of reviewing knowledge as corrections and fixing things, right? And oddly, there's not really a learning value that comes from it, which is I found strange. So I guess she means review as the critical kind of review, where you're really focused on critiquing and improving whatever you're reviewing. So that's the first section. The second kind of augmentation, derivation, and synthesis is annotation, which is probably a core practice of a lot of folks here, especially if you're a researcher. And so the idea here is that you're literally, this is the learning part of the review process, where you're actually looking at material and then trying to build upon it for your own personal use. You're adding ideas to it. And so I found it interesting. Some of these values weren't exactly explicit to me. Active reading is not exactly a value that you generate when you're doing an annotation, for instance. Well, I guess it depends on how you define value. But I really, again, I want to know, okay, you're annotating knowledge. That's a use of the knowledge, but to what end? What is the point of it? What are you really gaining? So that's annotation. The third is interpretation. Which is this process of, sorry, I guess I misspoke earlier. So these 3 really, reviews, annotation, and interpretation, are all part of the consumption where you're actually like trying to learn from or add your own personal ideas to knowledge. And so here we're getting at you're learning or you're consuming in order to simply add thoughts into your head about whatever the subject is. And the value here is what I'm looking for from this chapter the most, which is you're doing something with that knowledge in order to, it's adding to your ability to do something. The fourth one is translation, which is, again, and you're seeing this problem that I have about the Venn diagrams. Like to translate, you do need to interpret. To interpret, you do need to annotate. To annotate, you probably need to review. And so this tree diagram is not, I think, the appropriate way of presenting these things, because they really are processes that lead to one another. But the idea of translation is here, you're taking knowledge that you're consuming and then you're making it into something that's more useful, or more useful in your context or whatever. The fifth is synthesis. And that is you're actually taking a bunch of different pieces together and combining them. And I'm going to speed up just for the sake of time. And then the sixth, she wrote in figure 17.7 that this is knowledge synthesis, but it's actually supposed to be knowledge collaboration in this figure. And knowledge collaboration is when you're actually engaging and consuming knowledge with other people. And that's why, for instance, some of the types of actions you're taking are argumentative writing, or different kinds of collaborative work, problem solving or understanding or whatever. And so, yeah, that's the sort of 6 central pieces of this chapter. It is worth reading in a bit more detail if you want to take something more from this. But I really did wonder, again, what is the actual endpoint? What about knowledge innovation? This is my main interest in knowledge work. And it's sort of the process of innovation, of creating value from something, is sort of an output of all of these different steps. But again, as I've critiqued throughout this book club, a holistic view on what to do about knowledge seems to be missing from it. It's like all of this is sort of architecture that you're building, but the for what or the so what is really not there for me. but nonetheless, these 6 different pieces, to her credit, are a pretty good divide amongst what I would call 6 steps of knowledge processes. And so, yeah, it's not a bad framework from that perspective. It just doesn't necessarily take it home for me. So with that, I'm just going to very briefly, as I said, talk about the risks and harms of knowledge architecture, or that you're trying to control for when you're building knowledge architecture. And the question I had here is, what are the risks that she's talking about? And I'll answer that with one simple figure that she includes, which is these 6 different pieces. So the idea here is that you're trying, when you're building architecture to manage risk and harm, the whole goal is to minimize these 6 different pieces. So one is that, you lose the file, you lose the book, or you lose the conversation, and you don't have it anymore. The second is that somebody steals it. The third is that somebody damages it. The fourth is that somebody damages it to actually change what it means in order to cause harm to something else. And then the 6th is the creation of falsehoods. And the way she presents it seemed very sort of straightforward and not that interesting, as I said before, mostly because I think I fail to relate to this scenario in which it would be me, right? Most of my work is personal. So if somebody is tampering with my knowledge assets, then it's me in the past, and I've got to be, frustrated with myself for some reason. So I struggle to relate with this sort of business context where you have a bad actor coming in and trying to actually manipulate your databases so that it doesn't include the correct information, so that you make a bad decision and then, wreck the design of a new car or whatever your business is doing. So I found it hard to take away, and I think a lot of people will. And yet, then again, if you actually take what I said earlier as a joke and think about it for real, we do actually do this kind of thing personally. We actually do go into search, you're working fast on some project and it's just a quick thing that you need to go do. So you go in and you grab a file, and for some reason you forget to copy it and you move it to a different file or to a different folder instead, where you're working on that file. And then suddenly you've actually tampered with a collection of papers that you had put together in a certain place and damaged the integrity of that collection of papers. Similarly, the creation of a false asset, if you're, let's go back to that annotation or to the 6 steps earlier. If you're annotating a document and you're, say you're reading a scholarly paper on, I don't know, physics or something, and you're thinking about it as you're reading it, and you just have a brain fart and you write down something that actually isn't accurate, but then later your annotation processes extract that highlight out and put it somewhere else, and then you've carried this sort of false idea that you accidentally sort of forgot through, let's say you wrote down an equation and you got some variable wrong or something, then all of a sudden you've created a false asset, and you might be traveling that all the way through your creative knowledge work processes. So that's the takeaway that I had from this chapter, is that it's worth sort of thinking about these pieces of risk and harm and these 6 steps. And she goes through a lot of detail on sort of how to minimize each of them, and I didn't want to get into it. But it's worth thinking about that from a personal perspective in terms of how to make sure that you're not doing this to yourself, and how to check for it or correct for it when you might insert it. So that was really my key takeaway from chapter 18. I realize I'm not going through it in perhaps the detail you might have hoped, but I have no interest in doing so. So feel free to review the chapter and ask questions instead, and we can debate. But that is it for me. Sorry if that took a little while.
Should I pause the recording and we can chat about this piece pair for a little bit?
Yeah, I think that's fair.
All right, I'll do that. And there we go. Hello, everybody who's watching the recording. You missed land acknowledgement, but here we go. Chapter 19, which is the pairing to 18, and then 20 and 21, which are very short. This whole section of the book is short. She's kind of moving towards the conclusion. So hopefully in a couple of weeks, we will have a final conclusion to go on. So 19, why be authentic? Why do we care if we have authentic things? I mean, she takes it from much more of a business angle, but I kind of just wanted to strip all of that out of just trying to get at the core of authenticity. And really, we don't know if the things we're using are true. Like if we're, like the example Ryan was using, if we're using unverifiable or untrustworthy citation, and that gets carried on, it like impugns on us. And this can, have like minor effects, such as like a miscitation, Or in the case of my best friend, her father designs rocket ships, and somebody assumed everybody was using metric, and turned out somebody was using imperial, so the satellite exploded. So it can have very rather expensive consequences as well. And she's really making the point throughout this chapter that the current methods of determining authenticity really are not great. And they depend on formatting and packaging. And that can be like everything from you get something from Amazon and it's actually like a generic brand knockoff that has like used the same barcode. That's part of the packaging. Or it can just be like you have the wrong edition of a book that you downloaded off of some weird Russian site that has textbooks, and you answer the wrong question for your teacher. So that it could be a whole range of things of what formatting and packaging means. So she's making the point that new methods need to be adapted and old ones changed. I like to read these chapters backwards because I think the historical phases of them tend to give like a much better flow from what she's actually trying to get at. Sometimes I found myself reading the chapter and being like, oh, now that we're talking about history, I get kind of what we meant. And she starts with like, we've been copying things since ancient times, and like the Romans ripped off Greek statues, and also like the whole religion, just kind of copied and pasted it, changed a little bit, handed it in, and did not get a plagiarism mark. And as like the commercialism and capitalism begin to develop, and you have merchants and undergroups that can like buy or buy like actual originals, or they can like finally start to afford copies or forgeries. And people start to use these things as information just being a thing, as art. But over time, the market for fakes, forgeries, and copy grow, and then of course, the upper class is really interested in like preserving its authority and proving that their things are better. So this is when the shift from an object on display as information to an object on display as art develops, and then it moves from like rather from the content to like the actual object itself. And then we start to see authentication develop. To clarify what that means, authenticity, it's just something that's genuine, bona fide, what it claims to be. And then authentication is like flashback to chapter 8, which is like trying to determine when we say we have this book in hand, that it's the actual book. Like, do we have a first edition of Robinson Crusoe, which is worth $2 million? Or do we have a first edition second printing of Robinson Crusoe, which is actually only worth about maybe 10,000 if you've like got a really nice copy? There's a very big difference in money. So the concerns and like how you prove certain things comes down to that. And yeah, authentication is just that process of proving what we have in hand. There are three ways of authenticating something. You can discover it from the inherent characteristics of the asset itself. That's a great example of that is DNA. You can prove that somebody is themselves by using their DNA. Of course, there are some very weird incidences in which DNA don't actually matter. There have been several legal cases in which a twin has gotten off from a murder charge because they can't prove that the other twin didn't do the murder charge. And of course, like the science is trying to advance to get around that as well. But it's pretty good. Like if DNA is pretty great. There are some other ways like file hashing and like cryptography sound methods to look at files. They can be forged. They can be they're less susceptible to manipulation, but they can be. And sometimes you can't always get to that level. Like you can't take the DNA of a book, for example. Sometimes you can do it through a scientific method, and you can like take that book and you can like you can look at the carbon dating on the paper. You can look at some other principles, like knowing that paper in the 16th century was made from old linen rather than trees would makes a big difference in like what the chemical analysis of the paper is, and like makes difference how the ink shows up on the paper. So that's a great way of like being like, this is a forgery. But it can be tampered with. Like a very famous forger not too long ago spent quite a long time like getting all this linen and reproduced an entire book and managed to sell it for hundreds of thousands of dollars. The other example she gives is packaging, like that's like that saran plastic wrap that I always like manage to cut myself on, tamper seals, paperwork. This is like the PDF-A with the signed PDF thing, which is awful that you can't do anything with, that you have to break to just which there's your example. You can tamper with it. You can break the PDF in order to like use it and shrink it because they go like 50 megabytes, and nobody has time space for that. The third documentation, or third method, is provenance, and that's a lot more complicated. But that's a great. I'm using books here because that's like a lot of where I come from. But books is a great way of like proving a book is authentic. Is you can prove it was sold from this monastery to this rich person, and then it got cut in half, and then this rich person bought it, and then this other one went to this other library, and you can see the selling of how it like got to where it is today. I mean, that's archives did this, watermarks prove this encryption method, scientific workflows, all those sort of things kind of demonstrate different ways that you can do this. This is probably the most common. It's the cheapest, it's probably the easiest, but it's also the easiest to fool. Sometimes that doesn't matter, and we'll talk about a little bit in the next couple of chapters. And I think the last point that she really makes in this chapter is that everybody, all of the fields use all of these, like you don't just file hash, you also like make sure you're only sending the PDF file to people who are authorized for it. And I think that does tie very closely to the chapter 18 because it is kind of like touch on different aspects of security. I'm going to move, let's say 1140. Okay, I'll move to these other two chapters. I just wanted to do them side by side because honestly, they are really good together. So this is way more words than I wanted, but basically on the left you have chapter 20 and on the right you have chapter 21. And it's just the evolution is pretty similar side by side. Over time, like you have like in order to secure your assets, you have better locks and security bars. And then if you wanted to secure who had the proper authorization to get to those assets, you gave them the locks. And then, of course, it goes to security of assets, just like physical security of assets, alarms, and video tracking, and fire tracking, and of course, rise around privacy, and now use of computers and other sort of methods to protect the actual thing itself. And then protect who has access to it. That's legal protections, copyright, other sorts of things like that. And then surveillance system, digital locks and keys, and wireless and mobile privileging, which we'll touch on in a second. The reason she split these up and the general thing that she's talking about throughout these things in the first chapter on the left here is security of assets. Of course, the most common thing, and if you're familiar with academic publishers, if you're familiar with, I don't know, a company that wants to protect its IP, if you're familiar with like any sort of like security of like trying to make sure you keep your things yours, you want to lock it down, you want to password protect it, you want to make sure that people can't get to it. But of course, that can be pretty counterproductive if you've ever like really struggled with a system that, yeah, my library says I have access to this book or this journal article, but it's much easier to go to Sci-Hub or Library Genesis to download it, honestly, because I don't want to find my phone and like the little passcode and put it all in it. Sometimes it's just easier to do it that way. And a study of people who use Sci-Hub demonstrated that I think 60% of the users of Sci-Hub were already university students who probably had access to things in the first place. So this is the risk of overclassification, of over-securitizing something. And then, of course, chapter 21 on the right there. And she's kind of making the point about the infrastructure of like our whole digital environment today is like things very often are like you start a new company and they share their Google Drive with you. And that's just like at a folder level and like, okay, you have permission to everything in the folder. And I've been at jobs where I probably shouldn't have access to everything in the folder. And I'm sure other people have had like weird situations like that, especially if you grew up with computers and you're not, and you know how to use them and get around when you're in a company or industry that doesn't have, or hasn't have quite as long of a tradition of computer use. But so the point there is like make sure your security is embedded more at the document level, at the item level, rather than allowing it at the folder, because things can circulate pretty easily. Things can be freed out pretty easily, and that can be a real risk depending on what it is. If it's like, I don't know, a poster, not such a big deal. If it's a list of people's social security numbers or other sort of private information, much bigger deal. There are three things, like number 3, ways of securing asset, and the way you determine that is like how much encryption do you need, how much do you need to protect it from other people, And what's the most reasonable and practical way of doing that? Sometimes making a password in every single file is not practical. Sometimes it is if you're a company that has that kind of documents that need that kind of protection. And then of course, like authentication is, this was interesting to me. I of course have like two-factor things set up on my phone, my bank account, all this, but I didn't realize that it's really generally based on three things. It's called multi-factor analysis, but the three things are like something like the password, and something you have, usually that's your mobile phone. And of course, as technology advances, probably something you are, your eyes, your DNA, your fingerprint. Those are like the three types of authentication. And of course, two is kind of a pain, and like I'm sure three is coming in some cases. And I'm sure it's already used in some places. Let's see. I think that's the end. So I'll just go ahead and stop this recording.